She was 25 years old, a widow for 6 months, and the owner of nothing that could be sold. His ranch sprawled across the fertile basin, his herds of cattle drinking from a deep, reliable river while his fields of corn and alfalfa drank from the irrigation ditch he had financed and therefore controlled. For a steep price, he allowed smaller holdings like hers a timed allotment of the silty water, a charity that felt more like a leash. The question was not how she would prosper, but how she would last the winter. It was a question that hung in the dry air, unanswered, while the dust settled on Wei's few belongings and the valley waited for her to fail. She would stand at the edge of her property, her hands tucked into the pockets of the faded light blue prairie dress she wore every day, and watch the distant, orderly green of Harrison's land. It was a different country. Her own land was a testament to scarcity, a place where things ended. She had to find a way to make something begin. The idea did not arrive like a bolt of lightning but assembled itself slowly, from the dust of memory and the debris of the present. Mai walked her 13 acres until she knew the contour of every rock, the disposition of every patch of stubborn crabgrass. The soil was thin, alkaline, and greedy for water, pulling it down past the reach of any shallow roots. To change the soil of the entire plot was impossible. It would require tons of loam, years of work, and more water than she could ever afford. She remembered her father, back in a village that was now more dream than memory, tending his small vegetable garden. He did not fight the difficult earth of their shared courtyard, he had built it up in contained spaces, in large clay pots where he could control the soil, the water, the sun. He called it borrowing the land's shape without being owned by its nature. One afternoon, behind Gable's mercantile, she saw the answer. A stack of discarded cracker and nail barrels, their staves warped and their hoops rusted. To Mrs. Gable, they were trash, a nuisance to be burned. To Mai, they were 13 acres, made small. They were pots. She could not amend the whole field, but she could create 50, then 100, perfect little fields, each one no bigger than a man's embrace. In them, she could mix the good soil she found in pockets by the dry creek bed with sand and manure from the abandoned livery stable. She could control the drainage, the depth, the moisture. She would not grow corn or wheat. That was Harrison's game, a game of scale. She would grow something small, precious, and difficult. A luxury. Something that would command a price by the ounce, not the bushel. Strawberries. The thought was so audacious, so contrary to the valley's logic of wide rows and big harvests, that it felt like a secret. She would grow them in barrels, lined up like soldiers on the worst of her land. She paid Mrs. Gable 2 cents a barrel, using the last of the money she had sewn into the hem of her dress. The hauling was the first test. She used the listing wheelbarrow, her slight frame straining against the weight, her arms and back burning with the effort. She made 10 trips a day, from the back of the mercantile to her plot, the setting sun casting her long, struggling shadow ahead of her. The town watched. From the porch of the saloon, men would stop their talk to observe her slow progress, some with pity, most with a kind of detached amusement. Mr. Harrison rode by one afternoon on his tall grey horse, pausing at her fence line. He did not dismount. He simply looked at the growing collection of barrels, then at her, his gaze taking in her sweat-stained dress and the dirt on her face. "Quite the collection of firewood you have there, Mrs. Chan," he said, his voice carrying the easy confidence of a man who had never been contradicted. "Planning for a long winter." He smiled. There were moments she would stop, leaning against a barrel, the sheer, lonely absurdity of it all washing over her. She was a woman alone, building a farm out of garbage. The first runners she bought were thin and fragile, looking like little more than weeds. She planted one in the center of each of the first 20 barrels, pressing the soil gently around their roots. The work shifted from brute force to a kind of patient prayer. She measured her water allotment from the ditch with a religious frugality, carrying it in 2 buckets on a yoke across her shoulders, the way her mother had. Each plant received a precise measure from a tin dipper, the water darkening the soil in a perfect circle. The barrels worked as she had hoped, holding the moisture close, shielding it from the thirsty sun and wind. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. Then, a single new leaf unfurled on one of the plants, a brilliant, serrated green against the dark earth. Soon, others followed. The plants began to spread, sending out new runners that she carefully trained within the confines of the barrel. She weeded by hand, her fingers becoming expert at discerning the texture of a threat. One morning in late spring, she saw the first blossom, a delicate white flower with a yellow heart, as startling as a star fallen to earth. Then dozens more. The bees, finding this unlikely oasis, arrived and did their work. The petals fell away, leaving behind the hard, green nubs of nascent fruit. She watched them swell and ripen, a slow blush of pink deepening to a rich, glossy red. She chose the first perfect berry, warmed by the morning sun. It was no bigger than the tip of her thumb. She put it in her mouth. The taste was not just sweet, it was a concentration of everything she had poured into it, the carefully mixed soil, the hoarded water, the lonely, aching work. It was the taste of proof. It was enough. With the proof held on her tongue, her focus sharpened. She needed to expand. 20 barrels were a garden, 200 could be a living. She went back to Mrs. Gable at the mercantile, not as a scavenger but as a businesswoman. The older woman, whose face was a roadmap of prairie disappointments, listened from behind her counter, polishing a pair of spectacles. I laid out her proposal. All the store's damaged goods, split sacks of flour, dented tins, broken crates, and every unwanted barrel, in exchange for 10% of the season's harvest. Mrs. Gable looked at her, her eyes missing nothing. She had seen my solitary labor, the relentless trips with the wheelbarrow. She had heard the mockery. Most folks who fail around here do it loud, Mrs. Gable said, her voice dry as dust. You're quiet. It's unsettling. She paused, then nodded once. 10%. And I want to see the berries before they go anywhere else. Her first ally. Her second came from a place of memory. Old Mr. Abe, whose small homestead bordered the dry creek, had lived in the valley for 40 years. He sat on his porch most days, watching the world through clouded eyes, but his mind was sharp. I approached him not for help, but for knowledge. She asked him where the good soil settled, where the floods of decades past had left their riches. He was silent for a long time, then pointed a gnarled finger toward a stand of cottonwoods. The bend, after the big storm of '74, he said. Left 3 feet of black loam there. Harrison's father tried to claim it. I told him God put it there, and God didn't consult him. He watched as I began to dig and haul the rich, dark earth, and a few days later, he left a bucket of well water by her fence. No words were exchanged. Her third alliance was forged in silence. Ben, a young teamster who hauled freight for the mercantile, saw her struggling to move the larger, heavier molasses barrels. He was a quiet man, steady and plain. One afternoon, he simply pulled his wagon over, lifted 3 barrels onto her plot, and tipped his hat before driving off. From then on, whenever he had a spare moment, he would appear, his presence a counterbalance to her frantic drive, his strong back doing in minutes what would take her an hour. He never asked what she was doing. He just seemed to understand that the work itself was the answer. The tidy rows of barrels, now numbering over 100, had become a feature of the landscape, a strange and orderly anomaly on the valley's poorest stretch of land. Mr. Harrison could no longer ignore it. His initial amusement curdled into a kind of proprietary irritation. It was an affront to the valley's established order, to the principle that success required acreage, capital, and control. His ranch hands would report on her progress with a mixture of scorn and grudging curiosity. He began to see her not as a pathetic widow but as a stubborn weed in his garden. His power was structural, and he used it with the cool precision of a surgeon. A notice was posted at the mercantile. Due to unexpected seasonal shortages, the price for ditch water would be increased by 50%, effective immediately. Everyone knew there was no shortage. It was a message aimed squarely at the smallholders, and most awful, at her. The move was designed to make her kind of intensive, small-scale cultivation financially impossible, to force her to concede that the only viable path was to sell out to him. A week later, he approached her again at her fence line. This time he dismounted, his expensive leather boots sinking slightly into her dusty soil. Mrs. Chan, he began, his tone freighted with false concern, this is a hard life for a woman alone. I'm prepared to offer you a fair price for this land. Enough to get you back to the city, where you might be more comfortable." He named a number that was an insult, just enough to cover her debt and a train ticket. She met his gaze, her hand still, her face betraying nothing. "Thank you for your offer, Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice even. "But I am not finished here." His jaw tightened. He had expected gratitude or desperation, not this quiet refusal. He saw it then not as a negotiation, but as a challenge. He nodded curtly, swung back onto his horse, and rode away, leaving the threat hanging in the air between them. The heat arrived in July, a suffocating blanket that settled over the valley and refused to lift. The sky turned a pale, hazy white. The earth cracked. The ditch, which Harrison controlled, shrank to a muddy trickle. His own vast fields of corn and alfalfa received the lion's share of what remained. The water gates to the smaller plots barely opened for a few hours after dawn. Mai's allotment was a cruel joke, not enough to properly soak a single row. The leaves on her strawberry plants began to curl at the edges, a sign of thirst. The green berries, which should have been swelling, remained small and hard. This was the crisis, the direct consequence of Harrison's escalation. Her method was now on trial. A field crop would have died in a day. But her farm was not a field. It was 200 individual, manageable worlds. She began a desperate campaign of conservation. She used the grey water from washing her dishes and clothes, carefully rationing it. Mrs. Gable gave her a bolt of burlap, and Mai spent 2 days constructing small shades for each barrel, tilting them against the brutal afternoon sun. The real work began at dusk. While the valley slept, she moved through her rows in the faint starlight, a lantern casting a moving pool of light. She spoke to the plants, a quiet murmur, as if her own will could sustain them. She gave each one a dipper of the precious water, pouring it directly at the roots. Her body screamed in protest. Her back was a column of fire, her hands were blistered, her head pounded from dehydration and lack of sleep. She was sustained only by the memory of that first berry, the taste of proof. She was fighting for each plant, each potential fruit, in a silent, solitary war against the sun, the soil, and the man who thought he owned the water. After 2 weeks, the heat broke. A cool wind blew down from the mountains, and a soft, soaking rain fell for an entire day, washing the dust from the air and darkening the thirsty soil. Mai stood on her small porch, letting the water run over her face, feeling the tension drain from her shoulders. Her crop had been damaged. The yield was a third of what she had hoped for. But it had survived. The plants, stressed by the drought, had produced smaller berries, but their flavor was intensely concentrated, a perfect, explosive sweetness. In contrast, the valley's conventional crops had been devastated. Harrison's corn was stunted and yellowed, the ears small and poorly formed. His alfalfa fields were patchy and brown. The heat and water shortage he had engineered to crush his smaller rivals had backfired, damaging his own less resilient, large-scale operation. A week later, Mai took her first proper harvest to the town's weekly market. It was not a large amount, just 20 small baskets woven from reeds, each holding a pyramid of perfect, jewel-like berries. People stopped to look, drawn by the vibrant color and the sweet smell. Then Mr. Davies arrived. He was the purchasing agent for a grand new hotel in the capital city, a man whose job was to find the exceptional. He was passing through the valley on his way elsewhere. He stopped at her small stand, picked up a berry, and examined it. He ate it slowly. His expression, which had been one of professional boredom, changed. He tasted another. "Good heavens," he said, his voice quiet but clear. He bought all 20 baskets on the spot, paying her in crisp bank notes a price per basket that made the assembled farmers and ranchers fall silent. He then handed her his card. "I will buy every berry you can grow at this quality," he said. "Name your price." From across the market square, Mr. Harrison watched the entire transaction, his face a mask of disbelief. The barrel woman had just become the most successful farmer in his valley. The contract from the hotel changed everything. It was not just money, it was legitimacy. It was a line of credit at the mercantile, a new pump for her well, the ability to hire Ben full-time. He had been her silent ally, and now he was her first employee, his steady competence a welcome relief. He built new barrel stands and helped her lay down narrow irrigation pipes, making their work more efficient. The recognition from her neighbors came slowly and more meaningfully. Mr. Schmidt, a gruff German farmer whose land bordered hers to the east, had been one of her most vocal mockers. He had called her barrels prairie coffins one evening. He appeared at her fence line, his hat in his hands. He gestured toward his own withered vegetable patch. "My well is low," he said, not looking at her directly. "The corn is nothing. Your things, they lived." He finally met her eyes. "How?" She did not gloat. She simply explained the principle of contained soil and water conservation. He listened, nodding slowly. "I have some old barrels," he said. Would you show me how to mix the soil?" It was more than an apology, it was a conversion. Others followed, quiet visits from farmers whose crops had failed, who now saw her strange method not as foolishness but as a possible future. The ultimate validation came not from the valley, but from outside. An article appeared in the State Agriculturalist, written by a professor who had heard of her farm from Mr. Davies. He had visited, taken notes, and drawn diagrams. He called it the Chan method, a revolutionary approach to arid land horticulture, praising its efficiency and resilience. He wrote of her ingenuity not as a curiosity, but as a scientific breakthrough. The barrel woman was now an innovator, her name in print, her strange farmer model for others to follow. The end of the second summer found her standing on the small rise at the edge of her property, looking down at what she had built. 250 barrels stood in perfectly straight, weed-free rows. A new, larger shack stood where the old one had been, with a proper kitchen and a glass window that caught the morning light. She had paid Way's debt at the mercantile and had a small, solid balance in an account at the bank in the next town over. She was not rich, not in the way Mr. Harrison was rich. She did not own a vast expanse of land or control the valley's water. Her power was of a different kind. It was the power that came from making something from nothing, from understanding the subtle logic of a place better than those who sought to dominate it. Harrison still ran his ranch, his influence in the valley still immense, but a crack had appeared in his certainty. He could no longer dismiss the small, the careful, the unconventional. The valley had two models of success now, his and hers was the one that had survived the drought. A quiet satisfaction settled in her, deep and solid as a stone foundation. It was not the giddy feeling of victory, but the calm of arrival. Ben was working nearby, carefully mending a broken barrel stave, the rhythmic tap of his hammer a steady, comforting sound. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley, turning the distant hills a soft purple. The work was not over. Tomorrow she would need to check the plants for blight, and the next day they would begin the fall planting of garlic in a new set of barrels. The future was not a destination she had reached, but a path she was building, one barrel at a time. She took a deep breath of the cool evening air. She was home.